Idag så välkomnar vi Petra Dotlakilova och Noah Helvig som ska hålla ett föredrag med dans. Gudar, herdar och furier. Danskostymer i rörelse heter föredraget. Anna Källsdotter har gjort kostymerna som Noah bär och hon kommer också vara behjälplig här bakom med kostymbytena. Petra Dotlakilova, hon är teater- och dansforskare, specialiserad på europeisk danshistoria och teaterkostym och har en doktorsexamen från Academy of Performing Arts i Prag och Stockholms universitet. För närvarande så leder hon postdoc-projektet The Fabrication of Performance, Process and Politics of Costume Making in the 18th Century. Noah Helvig, han är frilansande dansare och koreograf som rör sig väldigt brett mellan olika typer av dans, som till exempel barockdans, samtida dans och interaktiv performance. Hans verk har visats både här i Sverige och internationellt. Och sen har vi då Anna Källsdotter som är kostymör specialiserad på historisk dräkt och kostym. Hon har arbetat som tillskärare och designer för produktioner på Kungliga Operan, Drottningholms slottsteater, Konfidansen med mera. Sedan 2023 så är hon kostymchef på Drottningholms slottsteater. Vi vill också rikta ett stort tack till Ulriksdals slottsteater Konfidansen och Drottningholms slottsteater för lån av kostymer och också från projektet Performing Pre-Modernity där kostymen av Fri är lånad. Och så lämnar jag över till Petra.
Ja.
Välkommen.
Tack så mycket Augusta. Men jag hörs, jag kan se det. Jag börjar på svenska, men jag hoppas att ni har fått information att den här föredrag ska egentligen hända på engelska för att vi har flera internationella gäster idag. Och vi också spelas in den här föredraget så den ska sprida också via nätet senare. Så det är bara information att ni skulle veta det. Vi ska ha liksom lite frågestund efteråt, men den ska hända på svenska så ni kan ställa frågor på svenska. Okay, so I switch to English now. Now it's in English. Yes, so the main topic of this lecture is the relationship between dance and costume in early modern period. Was the costume adapted to movement or the other way around? Was the dance costume different from everyday dress and even from the costume for singing or acting? Before we get into these more concrete questions, I would like to present some basic concepts of the theatre costume in the early modern period, by which I mean late 17th and 18th centuries. These concepts will hopefully explain its particular appearance, which might sometimes seem quite extravagant to us today. Theatrical costume in that period had several functions which were equally important. So, first of all, there was, of course, the practical function. It covered the bodies of performers and had to be adapted to their movement, or their movement had to be adapted to the garments. There was the dramaturgical function. The costume represents the character, which should be comprehensible to the spectators. They should recognize the character as soon as the performer enters the stage. There was also the aesthetic function. It was a decorative element on stage, which reflected the aesthetics of the period and was designed to impress the spectators and create a beautiful picture, to create a meraviglioso, as they say in Italy. And then there was the social function. Social function. In the case of court theatre, it reflected the social status of the patron and the noble audience that watched the performance. In the case of public theatre, it often reflected the social status or aspiration of the actors themselves, who would, in the case of spoken theatre especially, acquire their own costumes. Another issue connected to the social function of costume in history was that of propriety. What parts of the body and how much of skin was appropriate to show or not. These various requirements that were put on the costume sometimes clashed within the objects and created conflicts, especially between the social function and the dramaturgical one. In early modern society, as you know, dress had a very important place. It literally made the man and the woman. Through clothes, people showed their status, their social aspirations, and especially the upper classes needed to distinguish themselves visually and also materially from the lower classes. So when a patron sponsored a performance at his residence, for example, the costume presented on stage should also represent his wealth and his power. Similar splendor was expected from the genre of opera, which originated on the court stage before becoming public entertainment. On the other hand, the dramaturgy of the piece might require characters dressed in simpler garments, in case of comedy, in order to follow the basic aesthetic concept, the verisimilitude. This means that the story presented on stage and the characters should be recognizable and believable, similar to truth, similar to nature. These quite contradictory requirements had to be balanced within the object of costume, and it became a topic for discussion in aesthetic treatises about opera and ballet. For example, in 1640, Giovanni Battista Doni wrote in his Trattato della Musica Scenica. Now comes a very long quote, so don't be scared, we will go through it and you will see that it's really necessary to have it, and you have it in both languages so you can follow. And by the way, I hope that everybody has the text in Swedish so that you can follow as well. So Doni wrote, verisimilitude in the imitation and expression of those matters that are represented on stage should be a concern, but in the right way and in the manner that inspires the meraviglioso and the beautiful. Otherwise, when introducing shepherds, one should dress them in nothing else but the few simple pieces of leather or a similar rustic attire, and not the golden trimmed cloth as it is commonly done. And the same is true for servants and other humble people, who, despite the fact that they commonly wear nothing but primitive and poor clothes, because they appear on stage, wear rich garments, or at least they appear so, and beautiful to look at, so as to balance on one hand the delight and admiration of the audience, and on the other hand the verisimilitude of imitation. This is done so that the action does not lose completely its verisimilitude, nor becomes too simple or ordinary. So something ordinary is what we don't want on stage. In the same period, there is also a famous publication Il Corago, that is anonymous, and it offers similar ideas of the shepherd's attire, for example, listing the components of the operatic costume and their materials even more precisely. So he writes, although the shepherds represent rustic characters, they should be richly dressed with trousers and sleeves richly adorned. The skins with which they cover their chest and backs should be lined and adorned on the top of the with gold and silk roses. The headpieces should be covered with jewels and gargoyles, and especially in the place where close to the shoulders, because of course they cover the connection between the shoulder and the bodies. He also writes about the different nations, because of course in the early modern theater we had different nations on stage. So there should be some kind of verisimilitude, so we can recognize, make a difference between different nations, but there should be also something else. So he writes that having to introduce characters of a specific nation on stage, it will be necessary to adapt the costumes to the customs of the nation, as also when having to represent gods and virtues, it will be necessary to follow what poets have written and experience have confirmed in designing the costumes. But to tell the truth, in both instances, there will be a possibility to add something, some little thing, and if the costume done in that manner looks simply unrefined. So I should also add that, of course, verisimilitude at that time did not meet realism in any way. I think we understand by now that realism was not of really interest. Art was considered not life, but artistic representation of life. And also, in fact, the definition of verisimilitude, or to what extent and how the stage should resemble real life, has been a hot topic for aesthetic discussions ever since Renaissance. But until the late 19th century, the realism as we know it today was never a desired outcome, especially in the case of these rustic characters that we discussed, because they would be too unrefined and they would, as someone else wrote, offend the spectator's taste. So now I come finally to costume for dance on stage. Well, people, of course, have always danced, and one might talk about the adaptation of dress to the practice of social dancing in every period of human history. But I will focus on dancing on stage, because that is when the movement became more specialized and complex, which had consequences for the costume as well. In France, dance appeared in various theatrical forms since the 16th century. In ballet de cour, and later in comédie ballet, and then in tragédie en musique, opéra ballet, opéra comique, so that is different genres of French opera. Some of these styles, of course, reached Sweden as well. For instance, you know that Queen Christina danced in several ballet de cour herself. In ballet de cour, the courtiers danced alongside professional dancers. We can imagine that the courtiers danced in the style of social dancing of the time, so-called la belle danse, which was not easy, was graceful and elegant, but the professional dancer would perform even more difficult and almost acrobatic dances in some cases. Towards the end of 17th century, social dance and stage dance definitely separated, and the stage dance became more specialized and complex, and even women dancers were allowed on stage. At the same time, dance was still part of an opera and theater performance. So it was not a separate genre like today. The stage dance performed by professionals was divided in different styles. The styles related to roles or characters, physical qualities of the dance, and the aesthetics in general, all of which were co-created by the costume worn by the dancer, as you will see during this lecture. So in 1712, English dancing master John Weaver made a clear difference between what he called common dancing and stage dancing. And then he also distinguished various styles within the stage dancing. So you can see he wrote that it was divided in 3 parts: serious, grotesque, and scenical. Later on, we can find a slightly different categorization, which was then used during 18th century by the French and Italian ballet masters. So we have the serious style, half serious, demi-caractère, comic style, and grotesque style. And we will talk about all of these styles during the lecture and their relation to costume. So now we already have Noah ready for dance, and he will dance in the serious style. And you can observe his costume, you can observe his, how he holds his body and how he's doing the gestures. And then we will talk about how the dancing masters of the period actually described this style, and we will right away can see some costumes. I should also add that Noah is not dancing, because I see many dancers here, so he's not dancing any particular choreography from that period that was notated. He is inspired by the style and by the technique of the period, but he's not just dancing one concrete choreography. So just don't you can try to guess, but you will probably not find anything that you know. So I play the music and we can have the first dance. Varsågod. Thank you very much. So, well, since you are standing here, we can also like observe some of the particular parts of the costume. As you can see, the tonnelle, it's a typical skirt that was then worn on stage, and then we will see different shapes it could acquire. You can see the cape, which is quite short, because the opera singer would have cape all along. It was a train on the ground, but of course dancer couldn't have that, so they would have shorter capes. And of course you have the headgear with very tall feathers, which was very typical for representing the serious costume. So I thank you very much, and we will see you in a bit in a different costume. So, I hope you have now absorbed and observed the serious style. Within these styles, there were various characters that could be also specified by movement, gestures, and costumes. So, we have these 4 styles. But as Jean-Baptiste Dubos wrote in 1719, there could be up to 16 dancing characters in French theater. He also describes the change through time since dance became like really professional art. He writes that 60 years ago, fauns, shepherds, cyclops, and tritons danced in the same way. Dancing is nowadays, so 1719, divided into several characters. If I'm not mistaken, people in the profession count up to 16, and each of these characters has its own steps, attitudes, and figures on the stage. The women themselves have gradually entered into these characters. They make them felt in their dance, as well as the men. So here we could see some distinction, like some separation of characters according to the genres. It's not like 100% because like there could be some very serious furies, for example. But you can see that, for example, Greek and Romans and warriors and gods, princes and princesses, priests and priestesses could belong to the serious and noble genre or noble roles. Then we would have the lighter roles, which is the so-called demi-caractère, and that would be often nymphs, shepherds, zephyrs, fauns, etc. And then we would have the grotesque or comic. Now the difference between the grotesque and comic, I will come to that a little bit later. So you could have like peasants, like little refer characters, matelots, so that's like sailors, and also characters of Commedia dell'arte, furies, demons, and so on. Famous French ballet master Jean-Georges Noverre compared the different dance styles to various genres of paintings, using examples of famous painters of the period. So, if you know a celebrated Van Loo and his historical paintings, these are, according to Noverre, typical for serious dance. Those of the galant and inimitable Boucher represent those of demi-caractère, so that's very pastoral style. And finally, those of the incomparable Téniers resemble the comic dance. And the Téniers was a famous painter who would represent like the rustic scenes with dancers out in the village square, for example. So this parallel works actually very well when one knows like the different subjects and styles of these painters. Then now getting more concretely to the specificity of the serious dancing on stage that you have just seen, we can start by the definition of John Weaver from 1712. Again, a long quote. So he says, serious dancing differs from common dancing, usually taught in schools, as history painting differs from limning. For as the common dancing has a peculiar softness, which would hardly be perceivable on stage, for stage dancing would have a rough and ridiculous air in a room, when on a stage it appears soft, tender, and delightful. And although the steps of both are generally the same, yet they differ in the performance. Notwithstanding, there are some steps peculiarly adapted to this sort of dancing. such as capers and cross capers of all kinds, pirouettes, batteries, and indeed almost all steps from the ground. That means jumps and steps in the air. So serious and noble roles were characterized also by their controlled and graceful posture, which was the definition of la belle danse, also danced in social dance. There was the verticality of the body, as you can see when Noah danced, the elevation of demi-pointe, which would create light and aerial appearance. So everything should appear effortless, even if it was actually quite demanding, because like holding everything in was very demanding. I should also say, for those who don't know, that for a few decades, between 1700 and roughly 1730, dance was published in the form of the so-called Beauchamp-Feuillet notation, as you can see here. These were mostly ballroom dances, but also some stage dances are known. And for example, this Entrée d'Apollon, that would be definitely one that we would define as a serious dance. Among the known dance types that were used on stage, for those who knows a little bit Baroque dance, we can say that dances like Lourd, Sarabande, or Passacaille belong to the serious style. Then, according to Weaver, serious style is further divided to the grave and brisk dance. So the brisk requires vigor, lightness, agility, quick springs with a steadiness and command of the body. The grave, which is the most difficult, softness, easy bendings and risings, and address. And both must have air and firmness with a graceful and regulated motion of all parts. But the most artful qualification is a nice address in the management of those motions. So you see there is a lot of talk about gracefulness and about like graceful posture and the command of the body at all time. Some decades later, Giovanni Gallini, who was an Italian dancing master in London, so he published in English, described the serious style as naturally noble and even heroic. He says, firmness of step, a graceful and regular motion of all the parts, suppleness, easy bendings and risings, the whole accompanied with a good air, and managed with greatest ease of expertness and dexterity, constitute the merits of this kind of dancing. So we can also see he copied Weaver a little bit, but this is still like the same idea of a serious dance in 1762. On the other hand, what Weaver called the brisk serious style has become demi-caractère for the generation of Gallini, Noverre, and Angiolini, and other like in mid-18th century. And we will get to this style very soon. The serious style was supported by the serious costume, which was also called like that, as you can see on the design by Bouquet, which was rather rigid. It had like a rigid bodies of different kinds, often richly embroidered and decorated. It had the skirt called tonnelle and tall feathers, just like you could see in the costume of Noah. Then this next picture shows a design in a working version, also by Bouquet, so this would be like the serious costume, with textual description by the designer, which specifies the color palette, which was often in silver, white, but also in gold. The materials are such as glacé, gauze, and satin, and parts like bodice, tonnelle, long amadis sleeves. So sometimes on the designs, you can see that they have almost naked arms, but they would never have naked arms. They would be always covered. And that is called amadis sleeves, and they were often in skin color, so that they would appear as skin. Yeah. Well, on these designs, of course, we cannot really see the fastening, but given there is a lot of decoration on the front, it might be on the side or in the back, as we could see on the preserved costumes from the period. So here we have some examples from Paris, London, but it's actually an Italian style, the one in the middle, and from Sweden. So these fastenings, either on the side or in the back, makes the costume quite tight. It keeps the body straight, as it should be when it dances in this serious style. And as you can see on these costumes, the serious costume is also richly decorated. It's the most decorated of the other styles, which also adds the weight to it. So we can also say that it's like the weight contributes to the like erect position of the body. It has to like really carry all that weight. Also, an important part of the serious costume is the helmet with the hat, or hat with tall feathers, as you could see on the costume, which also influence the movement in quite an important manner, forcing him to keep straight and graceful. Within the serious style, we distinguish two major types of costumes. I didn't show you this back side of the à la romaine. So you can see that it's also tight in the back. So as I said, we have two, in mid-18th century, we have two kinds of serious costume. We have à la romaine. It could have different kind of skirts, either very rigid, or this is a later example from Sweden, from second, like later part of 18th century, which was already much smaller tonnelle. Well, almost no tonnelle, basically. And then during 18th century appeared also à la grecque. So if my PowerPoint moves on, we get to see the à la grecque. This is another costume you can see in the exhibition Theater Kungen, and it's like a very special kind of costume. We can see it a lot in French designs, and here it is preserved. So this should represent a Greek person who was not a warrior, because the à la romaine was a costume inspired by the Roman warriors uniform. But this one was then used for characters who were not warriors or in war situation. So we could make a difference. So we were like sort of working more towards the verisimilitude of a situation in this case. Or you could have a costume that is called here Roman civil costume, which is also the same cut as the Greek costume. And there is again comparison with a French drawing from Comédie Française. So you can see also the similitude between the Swedish costume and the French design. And now I can see that Noah is ready for the next dance. So he will now, you can come on stage, he will now show you the demi-caractère, also inspired, it's of course from this period we don't have any more notations, but it's inspired by what the theoreticians would write about the costume of the period. So it would be some shepherd dancing, and you can see that he is wearing a copy of demi-caractère that is preserved in Librus Cammaren. So, varsågod. So, Thank you very much. So you can see this wonderful costume, demi-caractère. It's one of a kind. Well, now there are two, but there is only one from 18th century preserved, which is in the collections of Liebruskammaren. And Anna Schilzeter made a copy of this costume, and she will come out later on to talk about the process. So you can also ask questions about the costume. It's very interesting construction. I will take it off now, like one part, because there is this coat with short sleeves, which is called bombe in French. I mean, we figured out of French designs and French inventories that this type of garment is called bombe. It's something very theatrical that you cannot really find in the everyday fashion of the period. And then, of course, he has this like long-sleeved vest with very decorated arms. So you can see like some very theatrical garment used for the demi-caractère. So thank you very much, and I will let you change one more time, and we continue here. So, we have seen demi-caractère, or half-serious style. You could notice already that it's much more lively, there is much more jumps. He moves more in space, like in also round patterns, not so much like in the straight patterns as the serious style. And of course, it's, as I said, more lively with higher jumps, which was kind of development of dance styles in this period. So we go back to Gallini and see what he writes about this style of dance. If the PowerPoint moves on. Yes. He writes that in the half-serious style, we observe vigor, lightness, agility, brilliant springs, with a steadiness and command of the body. It is the best kind of dancing for expressing the more general theatrical subjects. It also pleases more generally. So while the serious dance still had like its status of the highest form of art, and it was like admired for its command and for its gracefulness, in mid-18th century we could see like the leaning towards like the more lively genres that were also appreciated. Here you can see, yes, how the costume for demi-caractère, because it was kind of in between the serious and the comic, fluctuated also between the serious garment, which on the on your left side, then it's more resembling to the Greek character, the à la grecque, with this tunic that is wrapped around, and there is the tonnelle that you can see quite clearly, the skirt tonnelle on these two costumes, and a more relaxed garment, which was what we just saw, the demi-caractère, with an open jacket, which we call bombe, and without a tonnelle. Here we have another genre that would be a shepherd, so that could characterize as demi-caractère, but as you can see, it's more resembling like the serious costume. So like the characters of shepherd could fluctuate between more serious and more demi-caractère style, also in costumes. And so I show you again the demi-caractère, if we move on, yes. This unique object from Liebruskamaren's collection. So as I said, it's the only demi-caractère preserved in the world. This costume was worn by Duke Karl, the brother of Gustav III, during an unidentified performance. It was later described as demi-caractère in the inventory of Duke Karl's theatre in Rosersberry in 1806. So this is the entry in the inventory written in Swedish. So that's why we could match the object with the name of this garment. And if we go back to these designs that are preserved in the library of Warsaw University, designs by Bocquet, we can not only confirm that it corresponds, the costume, with the style of demi-caractère, but also the fact that the costume in Sweden was strongly inspired by French design. Now we move on towards the comic genre. According to Gallini, Comic genre was not tied up to the same rules or observations as are necessary to the serious and half-serious genres, but still requires taste, delicacy, and invention. This dance is closer to the rule sports and exercises, he writes, and should aim to provoke laughter. Here belonged characters from the lower classes like peasant, sailors, or drunks. So on these sketches, by Bocquet again, we can see not only more variety in costume types, but also in body postures that are quite in contrast to the noble positions of the other genres. The costume was looser, often in simple fabrics or less or no decoration. This is also second half of 18th century, so we are sort of moving towards more verisimilitude and less splendor or meraviglioso. But of course, it's still quite far away from the realistic costumes of the people. So like on the body positions, you can see slouching, you can see hands in pockets, you can see arms in hips sometimes. So this also gives us like indications about like the bodily positions of the different characters. On this, we go back, yes, on this slide, you can see one entry in the inventory, so that's the text, so that's from 1763, which is describing a costume of pastor, or pastor. It's a character that would define as comic. And you could see that there features the bombet, the jacket, bombet and large breeches of green taffeta. And on these images, which is from 1764, you can also see on the design this description written by the designer himself that also writes about the bombet. So that's how we could define this type of garment that is the short-sleeved vest that we can actually then see on the extant sample from Livros Cammaren. And then you can also see like they would be using the large breeches and like the type of costume that is more allowing to this like more free movement of the comic dance style. There are very few preserved costumes of this of the comic characters, let's say. But for instance, there is this fisherman and fisherman's wife from the Chateau of Český Krumlov in Czech Republic, which shows the simplicity, looseness, and roughness of the garments, which would also which would be allowed then in comic operas in late 18th century. Now we go to the grotesque dance. So grotesque stood on the opposite end of the aesthetic and choreographic scale from the serious. In this style could belong the sartorially and physically codified characters of Commedia dell'arte, but also rustic characters, rustic peasants, or infernal creatures such as demons and furies. Choreographically, the movement would include the use of the so-called false positions, so like opposite of the correct positions, unusual gestures such as extra wide steps and high kicks, awkward combination and rhythmic displacements of the step. The movements might involve exaggerated or unusual gestures, arm and leg positions, or acrobatic features. Gallerini wrote about this style, that the effect of it chiefly depends on the leaps and height of the springs. There is more of bodily strength required in it than agility and flight. It is more calculated to surprise the eye than to entertain it. It has something of the tumbler's or wire dancer's merit, of difficulty and danger, rather than of art. So, but then of course, like if you would have furies that define as a grotesque character, there was also like this aspect of, scariness. So like this, everything was allowed, so they would like really surprise and scare the audience when we speak about the furies. So here you can see some characters that I would define as grotesque. This is like from 17th century. There is a Pulcinella with his typical costume. There is a clog dancer, evidently associated with Commedia dell'arte, wearing a simple costume of a peasant. A Gorgon, so a monster from the underworld. And you can see also some acrobats. They wear a variety of costumes which are quite far away from the serious or noble garment. I think you would agree to that. For the lower or working classes were typical these wide breeches or long trousers. You can also see it on the Pulcinella. While the Gorgon wore tight garments imitating scales on their legs and bare breast and arms. But as I said, of course, they were not bare, they were always covered in some kind of fabric. Acrobats wear tight overalls, covering their body completely. And the cut of these overalls must have been done in a way that it allows wide range of movements. And I remind you that, of course, they didn't have any like really stretchy fabrics at the period, so they had to be cut in a way that it really allows that. And I have one costume of Arlequin, so I say hello to my colleagues from Musée de la Mode. So we can see here a Harlequin that is wearing this kind of overall costume or like long trousers and long sleeves, but it's bended in a way that is more allowing the movements. And you can see two other Harlequins in the exhibition upstairs, because there are two other Harlequins in the Swedish collections. And just for comparison, we can see a female Harlequin, which was actually a masquerade costume for women. But the last costume, as I said, we present to you in movement, representing the grotesque, is a Fury, created after the drawings of Louis René Bocquet and material descriptions from the French inventories. And I will get back to this at the end of my talk, so when the dancer is ready to dance the last dance. Meanwhile, I will talk a little bit about the woman's costume, because so far I only talked about the male costumes. Well, the rules were obviously different for women. As Claude François Ménestrier succinctly put it, women's costumes are the least suitable because they have to be long. Well, that's a fact, but professional female dancers soon found a way how to cope with this problem. And we can also observe differences in garments according to the characters they danced. On these two pictures, you see designs for some of the first female professional dancers on the French stage. The first one, on your left, identified as Mademoiselle Ribera, and she has a suspiciously short skirt, doesn't she, for 1662. That is because she was a child, only 14 years old at the time. She was a daughter of a Messier Ribera, Spanish castanet teacher at the court, and could only perform on stage at that time and in this garment because she was so young. Adult professionals were only admitted on stage in 1681 by the order of Louis XIV. On the other picture, you can see one of the first professional dancers who danced as Naïade in Triomphe de l'Amour in 1682. She wears a richly embroidered dress with theme of water plants, which of course is a Naïade, that was her sort of sign. She has also heavily boned bodice and a long skirt, which she is holding above the ground. But note that there is no train or cape or anything that would hinder her movement on stage, in space. When we compare the costumes for dancers and singers on stage from around 1700, the difference in their costume is quite apparent. You can see Terpsichore, who wears a female version of habit à la Romaine. So she has this kind of Roman uniform, sort of. But her skirt is shorter than Melpomene's skirt, and she has no train. Also, Gondolier's daughter, dancing for Lana in Carnaval de Venise, wears considerably lighter garment than Isabelle from the same production. The dancers could, of course, hold their skirts in some cases, as we can see here, but to be able to dance more and more complex choreographies, which included movement backwards, that would maybe work. But the problem was also that many of the characters were holding props and attributes, or they were playing castanets, which was very important, of course, for the whole piece, the attributes and the castanets, and therefore the shorter skirt was really necessary on stage. And so the period of shortening started in early 18th century. For example, and the famous dancer Marie-Anne Camargo. She became famous, among other things, for shortening her skirt even more than usual in 1730s, and in order to show off her brilliant dancing technique, because of course, as soon as the dancers became professionals, they wanted to compete with the male dancers, and the technique advanced as well. And then after holding up the skirts and the mid-18th century extravaganza with the really big paniers that lifted the skirt, but they were really quite cumbersome. The female costume obtained a considerable liberation by the end of the century. So you can see in the beginning, there was an issue of just showing an ankle. And in the end of the century, everything was shown. Of course, 19th century was another period of development for ballet costume that I will not talk here, but there's another aesthetic constraints and developments. So now I will get back to the Fury, and I will tell you a little bit about the process of creation of this costume that you will see in a moment. We did not have, of course, any extant costume of the Fury. So we started from designs. We have many designs, especially by Bocquet from second half of 18th century, where you can see different, the positions, the costumes, and the props, and everything that was used for these characters. And then we also used the descriptions, the textual descriptions, which were preserved in various manuscripts and also in inventories, especially of inventories of the French court, for which Bocquet, Louis-René Bocquet, designed the costumes. So the image gives us an idea about the visual appearance of the character, about the bodily positions, and also of the effect it should make on stage. So you can see it's really scary. However, some things are not visible on the images. For instance, whether he wears tights or shoes, it really looks rather that he's not wearing anything, or he has naked arms. These informations are recorded in the descriptions that list the various parts of the costume, the materials and the colors. So, for example, here we can see some of the descriptions that I translated here from French to English. So you can see that the costume would consist of bodice, sleeves, tonnelle, in flame red satin. Flame red satin was a very typical color with some kind of decoration in black. There is a relief mascaron that you have seen on the image. You can see this. So that was a bit of a mystery why we have these other faces on the costume. And then of course we have many of the snakes. It was also typical for the Fury. And you can see actually designs for Verdi's operas that still would work with the same sort of characterization of the Fury when there was a Fury necessary. So the snakes would stay, they would remain. And then we have, of course, a lot of decoration, like mosaic of milleret, of sequins. There would be decorations made in sequins. Sequins were very important in the period because the stage was lit by candlelight, and the sequins really helped to enhance the visibility of the character because the dancers would move around all of the stage. They wouldn't stay just in the front like the singers. So we kind of broke down all the information that we had from the inventories and from the images into some basic parts. In the inventories, these parts are always separate. So we opted for the construction, which was inspired by the faun costume that you see in the exhibition. So it's laced in the back, which seems to be like a typical dance construction of a costume. We have separate sleeves, which are attached only by laces, which also enhances the movement of the dancer. We have a tonnelle, but it's very soft. So it also makes possible a lot of movement. And of course, we have stockings. Right now, we don't have the gloves, but you just imagine that there is also gloves and shoes that should be in the same color. So the body actually looks like it's naked in this red color, but it's all covered. As I said, the colors are typical like the flame red, burnt flesh, very evocative color type. Brown, green, yellow, and black. So these are the palette for fury or demon. And then, of course, we have all kinds of decoration, including the paillettes, including this kind of cutouts. And as I said, very important to have a lot of papier-mâché snakes. For some performance, we had like 7 dozens of snakes for only 3 costumes, or for only 3 furies. So that was a very impressive. And then when you put it on stage, you actually see that this character becomes alive, and you have more than one character on stage. You have like the bodies that, the mascaron, the mask, you have the snakes that become alive because they are moving a little bit with the dancer. And that's like the effect of fury that then can become really scary for the audience, especially when there are so many. And I see that our fury is ready as well, so I invite Noah into stage. And we will see the last dance. It will be a dance of a fury from Gluck's Orfeo. Okay. So, thank you very much. This was also the end of my talk, so I will switch to the last slide. And I will invite also Anna Kjellsdotter to stage, because I wanted to do a little discussion now. Vi kan göra det på svenska. Vi kan prata lite grann om kostymer och om dans och om hur det känns faktiskt att dansa i olika stilar i olika kostymer från den tiden. Så ja, Noah, kan du liksom, nu har du inte dansat för jättelång tid i den här kostymen, i alla kostymer faktiskt. Vi har mikro, ja. Har du funderat nu, har du någon erfarenhet att berätta av de olika stilar och de olika kostymer, om det stämmer vad de teoriker från 1700-talet säger faktiskt?
Ja, men som första danseriös som hade den här guldharnesket, och det är ju ursprungligen normalt sett i papier-mâché. Nu hade vi den i plast, men att den är ganska orörlig i överkroppen, så den bara i sig själv gör att man har en mer hållen kroppshållning som passar danseriöst. Liksom. Medan till skillnad från Demi-karaktär som har lite mer rörlighet, men ändå man är ju väldigt elegant för att vara en herde.
Ja, precis. Det är ju det.
Men det finns nog ännu mer rörlighet, medan den här som är liksom mer delad har mer rörlighet alltså i sig. Och den här gjorde vi som en prototyp för några år sedan. För att utforska liksom korrelationen mellan den sömnadstekniken, eller hur Anna? Vill du ta vid?
Ja, men precis. Den här var väl ett samarbete som vi började med som en prototyp. Så den skulle vi jobba vidare på. Men det var ju mycket med färg, och när vi gjorde den var vi ju på konferensen med bara levande ljus. Och se vad det är.
Och vi hade satt liksom några paljetter, men även om det är inte så många, och de är inte så stor som till exempel Demi-karaktär, för Demi-karaktär vi har sett jättestora paljetter. Den har verkat jättebra på scenen ändå, även om de var inte så många. Du kan kanske vända om, så vi har lite paljetter här. Och det gör den här jobbet ändå, även om de är ganska små. Men på scenen med levande ljus, det funkar. Och också förstås en tyg som reflekterar ljus är jätteviktigt. Så de har använt tafta och siden och dessa material som reflekterar ljus. Så det var jätteviktigt, eller hur? Mm. Ja, och sen Demi-karaktär. Så det var väldigt speciellt tillfälle att faktiskt skapa en kostym efter den kostym som finns. Så kan du kanske berätta först hur har du liksom, vad har du ändrat? Hur är det jobbat liksom att skapa från historisk monster för liksom nutid kropp? Vad måste ändras?
Ja, precis. Med Demi-karaktär så börjar vi förstås att titta på alltså originaldräkten för att mäta upp den, med att göra ett mönster efter den. Och sen utifrån det sen har jag ju fått ändra till Noah helt enkelt. Och då får man ju se vad det var, alltså vissa delar, jag tror faktiskt att rocken, alltså det var vissa saker som man ser kanske passar ganska bra, och sen oftast är det vid axlar och rygg sådär, man behöver stora lite grann, men man kan ju fortfarande behålla rätt liksom linjer och hur man använder trådraken, för sånt är viktigt för att förstå liksom skärningen sen, att det liksom inte, att man inte ändrar det, försöker liksom följa så som de har liksom klippt ut, och liksom mängden tyg. Och sen också förstås vad de har använt för material. Nu har ju inte vi gjort en sån rekonstruktion där vi har liksom verkligen kanske vävt upp tyget och gjort den på sådana liksom mätt varenda tråd, men vi har försökt att hitta något som vi kan hitta så nära som möjligt. Så det är väl det, och det man kan säga är väl med de här just 1700-talsdräkterna att de är väldigt lämpade just för dans, kan man ju se, just för skärningen med vissa delar på skrå.
Ja, så liksom ärmen som är liksom böjd lite grann.
Ja, den är ju, när man skär den så är den ju liksom i en böjd form, så det är väldigt lätt att se på något sätt vart positionen ska vara för att det ska kännas rätt. Och man kan nästan se det också, så det känns som att den hjälper till. Och även med korsetter då, så finns det ju liksom olika lägen som känns mer naturliga liksom, när man har den på sig. Ni som har provat.
Ja, och byxor också förstås.
Ja, och just byxornas skärning som är ju också väldigt bra för just rörelse.
Mm. Ja, du sa nog att du liksom har ingen problem faktiskt när du har liksom dessa allt är möjligt faktiskt.
Så det är ju väldigt bra konstruktion, och mycket av det kan man ju liksom anamma även idag just för dans.
Så man kan säga att när du har gjort Demi-karaktär, du har ändrat inte så mycket, så Noah är faktiskt lite samma kropp som Hertikal.
Ja, vi har gjort det lite större, men inte jättemycket. Det är framförallt byxorna tror jag som är, de är så otroligt låga liksom, i grenen. Och så.
Ja. Och han måste ha varit duktig dansare om han dansade i den här Demi-karaktär som är ju lite mer liksom, om han faktiskt dansade, så det vet vi inte, men vi vet att han var ganska duktig ändå jämfört med Gustav III. Ja, vi kanske, du har mask nu. Vi skulle säga det borde vara liksom helt liksom ansiktmasken, och faktiskt alla dansare hade mask, även seriös. Så vi har inte hunnit att liksom skaffa den rätt mask för varje karaktär, men alla dansare på scenen på den tiden hade mask. Så det liksom påverkar också hur man liksom använder kroppen. För att anledningen var just att inte visa liksom effort när man dansar, och att liksom skapa en fin liksom utsikt, så den liksom uttryckt var inte någon av intresse först. Andra halvan av liksom 1700-talet, sen de började faktiskt skådespela också, men inte innan, så de hade alla masker. Så. Sen det påverkar också dansen. Vad du har mycket erfarenhet antar jag med masken, så hur det känns då?
Jag menar, dansa med mask beror ju också väldigt mycket på mask, men man tappar ju ett golvseende, och här med en sån kort scen så jag ser inte kanten när jag tittar ut så här, bland annat. Och sen beror det på, har man heltäckande så handlar det mycket om konstruktion, för vi hade några masker där uppe, men de hade ingen konstruktion för andning. Liksom. De kunde man ha på sig om man går runt, men att dansa så hade det inte fungerat. Så att, det beror verkligen på konstruktionen av mask och vilket påverkar dansformen liksom, och vad man kan göra. Man förlorar också liksom, sidoseende, så man blir liksom mer tunnelseende generellt. Så det är man många så kräver det mer fokus av alla.
Ja, har ni frågor? Vi kan open the floor for questions.